Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a connection between two nations, really quite far apart geographically, yet, deeply bound by a shared history, a history of struggle against oppression.
Hmm.
We're talking about India and South Africa. And it's a relationship that's, well, far more complex, far deeper than just standard diplomatic ties might suggest.
Absolutely. Our source material really digs into this,
Yeah.
revealing a bond that was forged in, frankly, unique circumstances. And these circumstances didn't just shape their bilateral links, they actually had an impact on global movements, too.
It's an extraordinary story, isn't it? When you think
Hmm.
about international relations today, we often jump straight to, say, trade figures or strategic alliances.
Right, the usual metrics.
Exactly. But the foundation here, it's rooted in something much more human, much more profound. It's that shared experience of colonialism,
Hmm.
the long fight for freedom, for dignity.
Oh, that's
So this deep dive, and we're guided here by the specific source material you've provided, which is a really thorough look at their historical links, how their diplomacy evolved, the nuts and bolts of their commercial ties, and how they interact in these big multilateral settings. It's all about getting beneath that surface.
Yeah, our goal today is to really unpack the layers of this connection. We want to explore, how did it start? How was it tested over time? How did it get revitalized? And crucially, why do India and South Africa remain such significant partners,
Mm,
both for each other and actually on the global stage today?
okay.
We'll be pulling out the key insights from the source material, giving you that shortcut to really understanding this dynamic relationship.
Great. So where do we begin?
Hmm.
The source material points directly to a historic bond, tracing it way back to the era of British colonial rule in South Africa. And this wasn't just a casual thing, was it? It was driven by a very specific large-scale movement of people.
That's right. The initial connection, as the source describes it, really stems from the British colonial administration's need for labor, cheap labor specifically, in South Africa,
For what specifically?
primarily for the sugar plantations, which were booming, and then later the mines became hugely important too. And to meet this demand, they set up a system. They started importing indentured laborers, mainly from India.
Indentured labor. That sounds quite specific.
It was. This process involved transporting huge numbers of people across the Indian Ocean. They were under contracts, but these contracts often led to, well, incredibly harsh exploitative conditions. It was effectively, as the source implies, a new kind of servitude that emerged after slavery was formally abolished.
So not a relationship of equals starting out, not voluntary migration.
Definitely not.
It was colonial policy that basically created this new Indian diaspora in South Africa. And it's within that very challenging environment that a key figure emerges, someone absolutely central to the story of both nations.
Without a doubt. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, later of course known worldwide as Mahatma Gandhi.
Right.
And the source material puts enormous weight on his time in South Africa. He was there from 1893 to 1914, nearly 2 decades. And it highlights this period not just as, a chapter in his life, but as the very crucible where his most powerful ideas were actually forged.
Okay, tell us more about that. What was it about his time in South Africa that the source says was so pivotal?
Well, the source is very explicit. It says it was during his time in South Africa that Gandhi developed, and this is crucial, practiced the technique of satyagraha.
Practice it there first.
Yes, it's presented almost as a fundamental truth,
Yeah.
and that is evolution as a leader and thinker. He arrived, remember, as a young, fairly unknown lawyer, and he immediately encountered this profound racial discrimination, this injustice aimed at the Indian community, but also, of course, at black South Africans.
Right.
His own experiences, famously being thrown off that train, facing segregation daily, humiliation, these spurred him into action. He started organizing the Indian community there and began experimenting with methods of nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience.
So these weren't just abstract ideas yet.
No, they were practical experiments, conducted right there against the backdrop of South Africa's discriminatory laws. And it was through these struggles, these campaigns, that he refined his philosophy and his tactics.
So satyagraha, the very method that would later become so instrumental in India's independence movement, wasn't actually conceived in India. It was born and tested in the struggle against oppression, but on South African soil. That's quite a powerful insight from the source.
It really underscores the deep interconnected nature of these anti-colonial struggles, doesn't it? Gandhi's experience in South Africa wasn't just some isolated event in his biography. It was formative. It fundamentally shaped him.
And how did that personal experience, those methods, translate into something broader?
Well, The source explains that this personal struggle, the methods developed, the solidarity felt among the oppressed communities there, it all laid the groundwork for what later became known as Afro-Asian solidarity. This concept started taking shape in the early 20th century.
Afro-Asian solidarity. What did that mean in practice back then?
It wasn't just symbolic. It represented a growing recognition among nationalist leaders, among movements across both Asia and Africa, that they shared this history of colonial exploitation. They had a common enemy, effectively, and a common goal, liberation.
Okay.
And while the source doesn't list, say, specific conferences or pacts from that very early period, the idea itself, rooted in shared experience, embodied by figures like Gandhi who'd lived it, created this foundation. A foundation of mutual understanding, sometimes even support, that proved surprisingly resilient over the decades, even when official relations later hit a complete wall.
And they really did hit a wall, didn't they? Because that early bond, that sense of solidarity, however significant, faced its most severe test with the rise and entrenchment of apartheid in South Africa. And here's where it gets, as the source shows, really interesting, because India took a stand, a principled stand, but one that also had real impact globally.
Absolutely pivotal moment. The source details how the system of apartheid, formally put in place in South Africa in 1948, profoundly affected the relationship's path. It had two major consequences, really.
Okay, what were they?
First, and most significantly, India made a principled, decisive move. It decided to discontinue diplomatic relations with South Africa.
Completely cut ties.
Completely. This wasn't just, recalling an ambassador for consultations. This was a total severing of official ties. And the condition was clear. This would last as long as apartheid was officially recognized and practiced.
Wow, for a newly independent nation itself.
Exactly. A very strong, very early, unequivocal condemnation of the system. Coming from a country that had just won its own freedom from colonial rule, it carried immense moral weight.
A powerful statement indeed. And they didn't just stop at cutting ties, did they? The source says India broadened its own anti-colonial fight to specifically include apartheid.
Precisely. India's foreign policy right from independence had this strong anti-imperialist, anti-colonial core. The source highlights that India widened its global struggle to specifically include apartheid, and they vowed to raise the issue on international platforms whenever necessary.
So keeping it on the agenda.
Constantly. Ensuring the fight against apartheid wasn't just seen as a, Southern African problem, but a global moral imperative. India played a key role in keeping it on the international agenda.
And how did that play out on the world stage? I mean, what actions did they take?
The source points to India's consistent, sustained efforts, starting really in the 1940s and 50s and continuing right through. They were constantly pushing for resolutions at the United Nations and in other multilateral forums, too, aimed at censuring South Africa for its apartheid policies.
Like which forums?
Well, the non-aligned movement, NAM, was a key one. India was a leading voice there. And they used that platform effectively to build this broad coalition, this international condemnation of the apartheid regime. It was a persistent diplomatic effort aimed at isolating South Africa, pressuring it to change.
So diplomatic pressure, building coalitions. Did this support go beyond just words and resolutions? The source mentions something about actual aid.
Yes, and that's an important detail. It shows the depth of India's commitment wasn't just rhetorical. The source notes that India provided monetary support, actual financial aid, to the Organization of African Unity, the OAU Assistance Fund.
And that fund was specifically
established to support the struggle against colonialism and apartheid across the African continent. So India was directly funding the movements and the nations actively fighting these systems on the ground.
That really cemented India's reputation, didn't it? As a staunch opponent of racial discrimination, of colonialism, aligning itself with African aspirations.
It did. But as you said, this diplomatic freeze lasted for decades. It was a long period of official estrangement. And the source is very clear about when the change finally came.
When was that?
It explicitly states the relationship only began to improve after the formal end of apartheid in 1994. With the establishment of a democratic government in South Africa, led, of course, by Nelson Mandela.
A huge turning point.
Absolutely fundamental. Those decades of official distance ended. And that old foundation, that historical bond of Afro-Asian solidarity, forged in the shared struggle, it became the basis upon which they could rebuild. And not just rebuild, but significantly expand the relationship in this new post-apartheid era.
It's quite a powerful example, isn't it? How shared values, even if they're buried for a while by political realities, can reemerge and shape the future.
Definitely.
And since 1994, that re-engagement has seen pretty significant growth in the relationship. The source material frames this development within a broader Indian strategy.
Yes. It highlights that the improved bilateral relationship isn't happening in isolation. It's seen within the context of India's larger Africa policy framework. India, you see, has been increasingly focusing on strengthening ties across the entire African continent, recognizing its growing economic clout, its strategic importance.
And South Africa's role in that.
Well, given its history, its economic power within the continent, and its regional influence, South Africa naturally holds a pretty central position in that broader Indian strategy towards Africa.
And the source gives us some very clear, almost hard-nosed reasons why India sees South Africa as such a crucial partner today. It comes down to pretty fundamental needs, right?
Exactly. The source is quite direct about it. India needs resources. Resources to sustain its rapid economic growth, and also resources and partnerships to help project its growing influence on the global stage.
As India's economy expands,
Its demand for raw materials, for energy, for all sorts of resources just increases exponentially. And South Africa is described quite accurately as one of the most resource-rich nations in the southern part of the African continent.
what kind of resources are we talking about?
A wealth of minerals, things
Yeah.
like platinum, coal, iron ore, manganese, and famously, gold. This natural wealth makes South Africa a sort of natural, almost necessary partner for a resource-hungry, fast-growing economy like India's.
So, a clear alignment of economic self-interest there, driving a big part of the modern relationships. And the source also suggests that South Africa's own approach since 1994 has really helped foster this growing connection.
Yes, it characterizes the post-1994 South African governments from Mandela onwards as having been quite pragmatic,
Pragmatic in what way?
meaning they haven't been driven purely by past ideology or sentiment. They've focused squarely on national development. The source says they have ensured the development of their country through pertinent foreign policy tools, which suggests, a strategic use of their international relationships, including the one with India to attract investment, boost trade, secure economic benefits, all aimed at contributing to South Africa's own growth, stability, and transformation post-apartheid.
So that pragmatic focus on outcomes from South Africa kind of meshes well with India's resource needs and its desire for deeper economic ties.
Precisely. It creates a fertile ground for cooperation.
And when we talk about pragmatism, about driving development, the source specifically flags commercial diplomacy. That seems to be a key area. So let's talk business. Let's talk investment.
Yeah, this is presented very much as a pragmatic move by both sides. The economic ties aren't just a happy accident following political rapprochement. They're actively cultivated. They're seen as central.
And maybe one of the most visible signs of this pragmatic alignment is South Africa's membership in BRICS.
Absolutely. BRICS, originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then South Africa joined, and now it's expanded further.
What's the significance of South Africa being in BRICS specifically for the India-SA relationship?
Well, the source highlights that joining BRICS strategically aligns South Africa with other major emerging economies. For South Africa, it was a clear choice. Build strong ties with global powers outside the sort of traditional Western-dominated blocs. Diversify its partnerships. Gain collective leverage on global economic issues.
And for India?
For India, having South Africa in BRICS places a key African partner within this crucial strategic forum where they already cooperate closely with giants like China and Brazil. It just provides another important avenue for engagement, for deepening those ties. It's a geopolitical alignment, but with really significant commercial undertones and implications.
And the sheer volume of trade between them, that really underscores the strength of these commercial links, doesn't it?
It really does. The source gives us a concrete number. India-South Africa trade stands at almost $15 billion at present.
15 billion US dollars. That's substantial.
It is. It reflects a really dynamic flow of goods, services, investment between the two economies. It shows how much interdependence has developed just since 1994. It's not some small niche relationship anymore. It's a major economic partnership.
Does the source highlight any specific goods that dominate this trade? Anything particularly important?
It does mention one particularly prominent trade relationship, the huge demand for gold in India.
Ah, gold. Always important for India.
Culturally and as an investment, yes. India is one of the world's biggest consumers, and the source highlights South Africa's role as one of the leading suppliers. Historically, South Africa was the world's largest producer, though production has declined from those peaks.
But still a major supplier to India.
Yes, the source emphasizes that. It's a very direct link. India's market needs meeting South Africa's resource wealth. Beyond gold, of course, things like coal, diamonds, other minerals are significant imports from South Africa to India. And India exports manufactured goods, pharmaceuticals, vehicles, agricultural products back to South Africa.
It sounds like South Africa is more than just a market for India, though. The source mentions Indian companies using it as a kind of launch pad, a regional hub.
That's a key point the source makes. It notes the Indian private sector is quite keen. That's the phrase used to leverage South Africa as a base for sub-Saharan engagements. Meaning Indian businesses see South Africa not just as an important market in itself, but as a strategic entry point, an operational base from which they can expand their activities across the wider sub-Saharan African region.
Okay, and why South Africa? What makes it so appealing as a base for Indian firms wanting to operate across the region? The source gives reasons?
Yes, it lists several key advantages South Africa offers. Firstly, it has a well-established financial market system. That's crucial for handling investments, financing trade, moving capital across borders efficiently.
Right, infrastructure must be another one.
Definitely. The source mentions proper infrastructure, ports, roads, telecoms, energy, which is vital for logistics, and just running a business effectively across potentially vast distances in Africa. And thirdly, and this is really important for business.
Let me guess, rule of law.
Exactly, a stringent rule of law.
Yeah.
This provides a predictable, transparent, relatively stable legal and regulatory environment. That reduces the risks that businesses always worry about when operating in emerging markets. These factors together make South Africa stand out as a reliable anchor compared to maybe some other countries in the region.
And the source actually names specific Indian companies that have set up shop there.
It does. It gives examples like Ranbaxy and Cipla, both major pharmaceutical companies.
Pharmaceuticals are a big Indian export sector.
Huge, and particularly relevant for Africa, focusing often on generic and affordable medicines. Then there's the Tata Group. They have interests from cars to steel to IT services, and Mahindra, known for vehicles and agricultural equipment.
So a diverse range of sectors.
Yes, their presence across these different industries really demonstrates the breadth of opportunities Indian businesses see. They're using that South African base, its infrastructure, its market access, to reach customers and clients all over sub-Saharan Africa.
Looking ahead now, the source suggests there's a specific step needed to really kick these commercial ties into an even higher gear.
It does. It states that to really enhance this commercial engagement further, it's important for both countries to conclude a preferential trade agreement, a PTA.
Okay, a PTA. Remind us briefly what that involves.
Basically, it's a trade pact where the countries involved agree to lower or even eliminate tariffs, quotas, and other barriers on trade between them, specifically. It goes beyond the standard rules everyone follows under the World Trade Organization, offering better preferential terms to each other.
And why is getting a PTA signed seen as so important for India and South Africa, according to the source?
Well, the source implies it would unlock significant further potential. By systematically lowering the costs of trade and investment, it would make Indian goods cheaper in South Africa and South African goods cheaper in India, hopefully stimulating much more trade volume.
More than just tariffs.
Potentially, yes. PTAs often include provisions to make investment easier, maybe streamline customs procedures, harmonize some standards. Essentially, a PTA formalizes and deepens the economic partnership. It gives businesses more certainty, more incentives, and could really push that $15 billion trade figure significantly higher. It's seen as a critical next step for a more integrated economic relationship.
Okay, so we've covered the history, the diplomacy, the economics, but this relationship, as you said, isn't just bilateral. It's very active on the world stage, too, in multilateral forums.
That's right. The source really emphasizes this. It says the relationship is equally strong at the multilateral level. India and South Africa find a lot of common ground. They cooperate extensively in various international organizations, various groupings. It reflects their shared perspectives, often, as major developing nations navigating global issues.
And a really obvious area of shared interest, just looking at the map, must be the Indian Ocean.
Absolutely. The source points out both India and South Africa are dominant players in the Indian Ocean region, geographically, strategically. This ocean is just critical for global trade, including, as we just discussed, the flow of resources like gold from South Africa to India.
So maritime security seems like a natural fit for cooperation.
It does. Things like tackling piracy, ensuring freedom of navigation for shipping, promoting peace and stability in that whole vast maritime space. Their shared stakes in this vital ocean make cooperation seem logical, even necessary.
But the source adds a bit of nuance here, doesn't it?
Yeah,
About South Africa's specific approach to using its navy in the region.
it does highlight something interesting. While South Africa possesses a strong navy, it apparently shows a little reluctance to project power in certain parts of the Indian Ocean. Specifically, the source mentions Southeast Africa.
Why the reluctance?
The source suggests it's because South Africa feels that Africa lacks a coherent maritime strategy overall, which seems to make them hesitant to take on a leading security role unilaterally in those waters.
And there's another area mentioned.
Yes, the Horn of Africa, near Somalia, where piracy has been a major issue. South Africa is apparently also reluctant to project significant power there. The source attributes this specific reluctance to South Africa's belief that the piracy problem stems primarily from the continuance of the failed state of Somalia.
So they see it more as a land-based governance problem spilling into the sea rather than purely a maritime security issue solvable by navies alone.
That seems to be the implication from the source material. It's a more political analysis of the root cause, perhaps influencing their view on the effectiveness of purely naval solutions.
So they're quite capable navy, and their regional importance are kind of tempered by these specific assessments. A lack of a unified African strategy and a particular view on the root causes of piracy.
Exactly. It seems like a pragmatic approach based on their analysis.
Yeah.
However, the source is clear. This reluctance isn't total inaction. It specifically notes that South Africa has participated in joint naval exercises.
Hmm.
The purpose mentioned is to protect its maritime zone.
Ah, so closer to home.
Yes, it indicates a willingness to cooperate and use their naval assets when it directly concerns the security of their own coastline, their immediate maritime interests. It seems more focused, perhaps, and expansive in terms of naval engagement further afield.
Okay. Beyond the maritime sphere, where else does the source tell us India and South Africa team up multilaterally?
Well, it lists several key forms. We've already talked about BRICS. That's crucial not just for economics, but also for political dialogue among these major emerging economies.
Right.
Then there's the IBSA framework. That's quite unique, a trilateral group. India, Brazil, and South Africa.
IBSA, what do they do?
The source says they undertake broad cooperation across a whole range of areas: defense, trade, culture, science, technology. It's really aimed at strengthening South cooperation, building links between these three influential democracies from different continents.
And they also work together in big global negotiations, economic, environmental.
Yes, the source points to their close collaboration within the BASIC group. That's Brazil, South Africa, India, and China.
Basic.
This group works together particularly closely at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and, very significantly, in climate change negotiations. BASIC acts as a bloc of major developing economies, coordinating their positions to advocate for their interests. Pushing for things like common but differentiated responsibilities in the climate talks, trying to balance development needs with environmental action.
And the source suggests another forum, specifically for enhancing that maritime cooperation we talked about.
It does. It proposes the Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA. Yes, it's a regional body bringing together countries that border the Indian Ocean. The source suggests this could be a really useful platform to specifically enhance maritime cooperation between India and South Africa, building on those shared interests in the region's security and trade.
Now, this is where it gets perhaps a little tricky. The source mentions what it calls a peculiar feature of their multilateral relationship, and it sounds like this can sometimes be a source of friction.
This is a really crucial nuance the source brings out. This peculiar feature is South Africa's strong commitment, its tendency to uphold a Pan-African position in a majority of these cases.
Pan-African position, meaning what exactly?
Meaning that in international forums, South Africa often tries to align its stance with the consensus view or the stated position of the African Union, AU, or the broader group of African nations. It sees itself as representing not just South Africa, but African interests more broadly.
Okay.
And the source is quite explicit. This tendency can, at times, strains the India-SA cooperation.
Ah. So even though they share many perspectives as major developing nations, South Africa's deep commitment to representing that collective African interest can sometimes lead it down a different path than India's specific foreign policy priorities.
That's exactly it. It reflects South Africa's identity. It's not just another nation state. It sees itself and is often seen by others as a leading voice for the continent, a committed member of the African collective. So when the African consensus on a particular issue doesn't perfectly align with India's national position, well, it can create tension, or at least require some very delicate diplomatic balancing in their joint efforts.
And the source gives us a very clear case study to illustrate exactly this point. It focuses on the Arab Spring and the responsibility to protect principle, R2P.
Yes, this case study is used by the source specifically to show how cracks in India-SA multilateral diplomacy visible. It sets the scene. The period is the Arab Spring, 2011-2012. And it just so happened that both India and South Africa were serving as non-permanent members on the UN Security Council at that exact time.
Okay, so they were both at the top table.
Right, and not just them. Two other African nations, Nigeria and Guinea-Bissau, were also on the council then. So you had four significant voices from the global south, three of them African, right there on the Security Council during a period of major upheaval.
And the big contentious issue they faced during that time was the intervention in Libya.
Yes, the NATO intervention against the Gaddafi regime in Libya. That was a critical, highly divisive issue dominating the Security Council agenda. The Council had to vote on resolutions authorizing international action, initially framed as protecting civilians, but which quickly evolved into military intervention.
And the source details a specific vote on this that really exposed the strain between India and South Africa.
It does. It states that when it came to the crucial vote on UN Resolution 1973, the one authorizing a no-fly zone and all necessary measures to protect civilians, which became the basis for military action, India abstained.
India abstained. And South Africa.
Crucially, the source highlights that the three African states on the Council at the time, including South Africa, voted in favor of the resolution.
Wow. So abstention versus approval on such a critical, high-stakes resolution, that's a very visible difference.
It absolutely was. And it clearly illustrated the divergence in their approaches at that moment.
Did the source explain the reasoning behind these different votes? Why did the African states, including South Africa, vote yes?
According to the source, yes. The rationale given for the African states voting in favor was that they saw UN Resolution 1973 as being in sync with Article 4 of the African Union's own constitutive acts from the year 2000.
Article 4 of the AU Act. What does that say?
It's actually quite a progressive and potentially controversial article. It supports collective intervention by the Union in a member state in order to prevent war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. It's essentially the AU's own articulation of the responsibility to protect principle, R2P.
So the AU Charter itself allows for intervention in member states to stop mass atrocities.
Exactly. It posits that states have a duty to protect their own people, and if they fail, the collective, in this case, the AU initially, but by extension potentially the UN has a responsibility to step in, possibly even with force as a last resort. So for South Africa and the other African states on the UNSC, their vote was rooted in a principle they had already collectively agreed upon and enshrined in their own continental charter. They saw the situation in Libya through that lens.
Okay, that explains the South African and African position. What about India's abstention? What was the reasoning there, according to the source?
India's stance, as the source puts it, reflected its long-standing foreign policy principles. It states that India continues to form non-intervention and sovereignty as its ideal policy in such matters of responsibility to protect R2P.
Non-intervention and sovereignty.
Yes. India has traditionally been very cautious about interventions in the internal affairs of sovereign states. It emphasizes national sovereignty, non-interference. While India certainly supports the idea of protecting civilian populations, its approach to the doctrine of R2P has been more reserved. It often expresses concern about how intervention doctrines might be applied selectively or potentially misused, undermining state sovereignty. So India's abstention was consistent with its historical foreign policy approach, which clearly differed from the AU's specific stance embodied in Article 4H.
So this Libya vote perfectly illustrates how South Africa's commitment to a pan-African position, aligning with the AU's more interventionist R2P stance in this case, led to a different decision than India's, which was rooted in its core principle of non-intervention.
Precisely. It's a textbook example, really, of how those potential strains arising from different foundational principles or allegiances can manifest in multilateral settings.
And this seems important.
Yes, it's crucial to note, and the source makes this point immediately after detailing this divergence, that despite such strains, the relationship continues to grow.
Okay, so these differences, while real and visible, haven't derailed the whole thing.
Apparently not. The source suggests that while these disagreements happen, they haven't fundamentally altered the overall positive trajectory of the relationship. It even adds, reinforcing the economic driver, that India will seek deep economic engagement in the time ahead with SA as its own demand for resources grows at home, which reiterates that powerful economic imperative continues to push the relationship forward regardless of occasional multilateral hiccups.
That's a key takeaway then. Friction points exist, they're acknowledged, but they don't necessarily negate the overall momentum, especially when strong economic realities are in play.
Seems to be the case here.
Let's look at a more recent specific example. The Indian Prime Minister's visit to South Africa in July 2016. That seems to encapsulate some of these dynamics too.
Yes, the source highlights this visit. It was part of the Indian PM's four-nation tour of African countries that summer, and he met with the then president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma. Significant bilateral meeting.
And the timing of this visit.
Yeah.
It seems particularly relevant given a big global discussion involving India around then.
It was very relevant. The source points out the visit happened just weeks after the annual big meeting, the plenary session of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the NSG, held in Seoul in June 2016.
The NSG, that's the group controlling nuclear technology exports.
Exactly. And a major item on the agenda at that Seoul meeting was India's application to become a member of the NSG, a long-standing goal for India.
And what was South Africa's position on India's bid at that specific meeting, according to the source?
Well, the source states that at the Seoul NSG meeting, some players, including South Africa, had raised procedural concerns.
Procedural concerns.
Yes. And the outcome was that India did not get membership at that meeting. So South Africa was among the countries that felt there were issues possibly related to the NSG's own rules, maybe the process for admitting countries like India that hadn't signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, that needed sorting out before India's application could be approved.
And the source provides some really crucial background for understanding why South Africa might take that position on nuclear matters.
It provides vital context. It describes South Africa as an ardent supporter of non-proliferation. And it says its credentials in this area are so strong that in 1994, when South Africa ended apartheid, it went on to destroy its entire nuclear arsenal.
Destroyed its nuclear weapons. Voluntarily.
Voluntarily dismantled its entire nuclear weapons program as it transitioned to democracy. It's the only country in the world to have done that. This gives South Africa, a unique moral and political standing on issues of nuclear proliferation and disarmament.
You can see how that history would inform their approach.
Absolutely. It naturally shapes how they view groups like the NSG and applications for membership, including India's. Their procedural concerns likely stemmed from a commitment to upholding the integrity of the non-proliferation regime based on their own unprecedented actions and principles.
So while India was obviously seeking South African support for its NSG membership, South Africa's own strong non-proliferation stance led it to raise these issues. Was it specifically discussed during the Prime Minister's visit just after that Seoul meeting?
Yes, the source explicitly states that during the PM's visit, an important dimension discussed was South African support to India for NSG. This shows that even after the setback in Seoul, getting South Africa's backing remained a high-level priority for India. The diplomatic engagement on this sensitive issue continued.
Okay. But beyond those, perhaps difficult diplomatic discussions, the visit also had a very concrete, very positive economic outcome highlighted by the source.
Yes, this was a major announcement made during the visit. The source notes that the Indian Prime Minister announced that Cipla, one of India's leading pharmaceutical companies, would establish a major manufacturing facility in South Africa.
Cipla again, setting up manufacturing there.
A big one. The source gives specifics. The facility was planned for the Special Economic Zone of Duke Trade Port in Durban.
And what would it make?
Its main purpose would be to manufacture drugs for cancer treatment using living organisms. These are known as biosimilars.
Biosimilars, those are complex, advanced medicines.
Very much so. They're highly similar versions of original complex biological drugs used for diseases like cancer. Often, they offer more affordable alternatives, which is hugely important.
And the scale of this, the investment, the impact.
The source give the numbers. The investment was stated as 591 crore Indian rupees. Now, putting that into perspective, 591 crore rupees is roughly, depending on the exchange rate then, maybe 70 to 80 million US dollars. That's a substantial chunk of foreign direct investment.
Significant FDI.
And jobs.
Yes. The facility was projected to generate more than 300 science-related jobs in South Africa. high-skill jobs.
That really is a significant development, isn't it? It's not just about selling goods anymore. It's about India bringing advanced manufacturing, high-tech investment, and skilled job creation directly into South Africa, especially in a critical field like healthcare.
Absolutely. You can see the benefits for both sides. For South Africa, economic development, that FDI inflow, skilled jobs, and potentially, crucially, better access to vital, often very expensive, cancer treatments through local production. It leverages South Africa's infrastructure, its regulatory environment, its skilled workforce.
And for India?
It's a major expansion for its powerful pharmaceutical industry into a key African market. It's using South Africa as that strategic regional hub we talked about earlier. It's a tangible outcome, a real demonstration of the economic partnership delivering concrete benefits.
Okay, so let's try and bring all these different threads together now. We've covered quite a journey. From those shared historical struggles, that early solidarity,
Rooted in colonialism, Gandhi's experiences, the anti-apartheid fight,
through those decades of the diplomatic freeze during apartheid,
a long period of official silence, but perhaps the underlying connection remained.
to this really robust re-engagement after 1994, a multifaceted relationship now.
That's right. The evolution is really shaped by that unique history. Those foundational elements created a bond that could be drawn upon later, even after years of disconnection.
And what are the main things driving the relationship forward today based on our source material?
The key drivers seem very clear and quite pragmatic, actually. You have India's growing need for resources essential for its economic expansion, for projecting its influence. And that finds a natural match in South Africa, described as one of Africa's most resource-rich nations, which also possesses established infrastructure and, importantly, has shown a pragmatic approach to foreign policy focused on its own development.
And we saw that pragmatism translating into really significant commercial links, that near $15 billion in trade.
The vital gold trade connection.
Indian companies using South Africa as that regional hub, enabled by its infrastructure, its rule of law.
With the potential for a preferential trade agreement, a PTA, to deepen those ties even further.
And then there's the strong multilateral dimension, cooperating in key forums like BRICS, IBSA, the BASIC group.
Aligning often on global economic and environmental issues, recognizing potential for maritime cooperation in the Indian Ocean.
But, as the source was careful to point out, it's not always smooth sailing. There's complexity. That peculiar feature, as the source called it, of South Africa prioritizing a Pan-African stance.
Right. That can sometimes create friction, lead to divergence. We saw that clearly in the R2P case study around the Libya vote. Different foundational principles leading to different actions.
Even on issues like NSG membership, South Africa's own strong non-proliferation history and principles shaped its procedural concerns.
It highlights a relationship that has to navigate both strong alignment and occasional divergence. It reflects the reality that both India and South Africa are significant independent global players. They have their own national interests, their own regional commitments, and South Africa's deep ties and leadership role within Africa is a really important factor shaping its foreign policy.
Yet, despite those challenges, those nuances, the overall picture that the source material paints is one of a relationship that, on balance, continues to strengthen, continues to deepen.
India is actively seeking closer economic ties, driven by its own needs, and South Africa clearly sees benefits in that partnership for its own development goals. The momentum seems positive.
It really is a dynamic interplay, isn't it? History, economics, diplomacy, all constantly evolving on the global stage. So for you listening, we think understanding this India-South Africa relationship offers some really valuable insights into how international relations actually work. It shows how historical bonds, even ones born from hardship like colonialism and indentured labor, can lay the groundwork for future strategic partnerships.
And it really highlights the undeniable role of economic needs. Things like resource security for a growing power like India, driving modern diplomacy in very practical ways.
It also demonstrates something quite important, that countries can be very close partners in many areas, trade, investment, certain global issues, while still holding differing views or priorities in others. Especially when navigating complex multilateral systems where regional commitments like South Africa's Pan-African focus or fundamental foreign policy principles like India's emphasis on sovereignty can lead to divergent paths.
It's not always black and white. Relationships can be strong and complex simultaneously.
Absolutely. Which leaves us with a final, perhaps provocative thought for you to mull over, drawn from the themes and the source material we've explored today. Given this deep, complex history of shared struggle alongside India's ever-increasing demand for resources, how might that inherent tension, the push and pull between South Africa's commitment to Pan-African solidarity and the specific, pragmatic bilateral interests driving both nations, how might that tension continue to shape their relationship as they face future global challenges together, whether it's within an evolving BRICS, managing security in the Indian Ocean, or tackling huge issues like climate change and reforming global governance?
A relationship certainly built on a unique past and clearly facing a very complex dynamic future.